Imagine this. The President of the United States, a 49-year-old bachelor, suddenly gets married. But his bride isn't a wealthy widow or a political insider. She's a 21-year-old college student. And here's the detail that changes everything. He is her legal guardian, the man who had known and cared for her since she was an infant, following the tragic death of her father. This isn't a movie script. This is the true story of Frances Folsom Cleveland. To the public, she was a princess who walked into the White House, a fashion icon, and the youngest first lady in history. But behind the fairy tale wedding and the perfect smile was a far more complicated story, one of a promise of duty and of a relationship that challenged every norm of the era. This isn't just a love story. It's a story of power, of loss, and of a young girl who had to learn how to become a woman under the watchful eye of an entire nation. To understand Frances, you have to understand the world that made her. America in the latter half of the 19th century was a place of dizzying contradictions. They called it the Gilded Age, and for good reason. On the surface, there was an explosion of wealth, industry, and invention. Railroads stitched the country together. Skyscrapers scraped the sky, and families like the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies built palaces they called cottages. But beneath that glittering surface lay deep social anxieties, staggering poverty, and a set of social rules as rigid as a Victorian corset, especially for women. A woman of good standing was expected to be a beautiful ornament, a reflection of her husband's success. Her world was the home, her duties were social, and her opinions, if she had any, were best kept to herself. She was to be pious, pure, and submissive. It was into this gilded cage that Frances Folsom was born in 1864 in the booming industrial city of Buffalo, New York. Her father, Oscar Folsom, was a charismatic and successful lawyer, and his law partner, a man he admired and trusted above all others, was a serious, rather stoic bachelor named Grover Cleveland. From the very beginning, Cleveland was a part of Frances's life. He was there when she was an infant, a family friend who doted on the bright, charming little girl. He bought her her first baby carriage. He was the jovial, if slightly awkward, Uncle Cleve who bounced her on his knee. He was a constant, steady presence in the Folsom household. And then, when Frances was just 11 years old, that world shattered. Oscar Folsom was killed in a horrific carriage accident. The tragedy was sudden and absolute, leaving his wife Emma and young Frances adrift in grief and uncertainty. In his will, Folsom had made a specific request. He named his trusted partner, Grover Cleveland, as the co-administrator of his estate. But Cleveland, a man known for his deep sense of duty, went further. He essentially became Frances's legal guardian. Overnight, the 38-year-old bachelor, a man rapidly rising in politics, became responsible for the upbringing and education of an 11-year-old girl. He wasn't just Uncle Cleve anymore. He was a figure of authority, a protector, the man who would guide her future. He oversaw her finances, advised her mother on her schooling, and took a profound, almost paternal interest in her development. As Frances grew from a clever girl into an intelligent and strikingly beautiful young woman, their correspondence continued. He was in Albany serving as governor of New York, and she was a student at Wells College. His letters were filled with advice, encouragement, and a formal but deep affection. He signed them "Yours faithfully, Grover Cleveland." She, in turn, looked up to him as a mentor and a father figure, or so everyone believed. By 1884, the unthinkable happened. Grover Cleveland, the ugly, honest bachelor from Buffalo, was elected the 22nd President of the United States. He moved into the White House alone. His sister Rose, serving as his official hostess. The nation was immediately obsessed with one question: who would be the First Lady? The Washington rumor mill went into overdrive. The press speculated wildly, and the name that kept coming up was Emma Folsom, Frances's widowed mother. It seemed a sensible match. She was age-appropriate, elegant, and already close to the president. Frances and her mother, following her college graduation, embarked on a grand tour of Europe, a trip financed and encouraged by President Cleveland. While they were away, the rumors of his impending marriage to Mrs. Folsom reached a fever pitch. But something else was happening, something conducted entirely in secret through transatlantic letters. The president wasn't writing to the mother. He was writing to the daughter. The truth was, at some point, the relationship between the guardian and his ward had changed. The paternal affection had blossomed into something else entirely. When he proposed marriage by letter, the 21-year-old Frances accepted. The President of the United States, a man of 49, was going to marry the young woman he had helped raise. When the news was finally announced, it sent a shockwave across the country. The press was stunned. Society was scandalized. The woman they had all assumed was the future First Lady was actually to be the mother-in-law. The bride was her daughter, a girl younger than most of their own children. It was a sensation. On June 2nd, 1886, Frances Folsom made history. In an intimate ceremony in the Blue Room of the White House, the only time a president has ever been married in the executive mansion, she became Frances Cleveland. She wore a gown of ivory satin and orange blossoms, her face veiled. The ceremony was small, attended only by close friends and family, with John Philip Sousa's Marine Band playing in the hall. When the minister asked, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" there was no one to answer. Her father was gone. So the minister simply continued. At 21 years old, she was the new First Lady of the United States. The American public, after the initial shock, fell completely and utterly in love with her. They called her Frankie, a nickname she personally disliked, preferring the more formal Frances. She was a phenomenon. Young, graceful, and refreshingly down-to-earth, she was a stark contrast to the stuffy, formal hostesses of the past. She was, in effect, America's first celebrity First Lady. Her every move was chronicled. Newspapers breathlessly reported on her fashion choices. The way she wore her hair, a classic, elegant knot at the nape of her neck, was copied by women from New York to San Francisco. Her face was used, without her permission, to sell everything from soap to sewing machines. She was the Princess Diana of her day, a media obsession, and she handled it with a grace that belied her years. She knew the power of her image. Instead of hiding from the public, she opened the doors of the White House. She held 2 public receptions a week, including one on Saturday afternoons, so that working women who couldn't leave their jobs during the week could have a chance to come and shake her hand. Thousands of people would line up for hours just for a brief moment with her. She would stand for hours smiling, greeting each person with genuine warmth, even when her arms ached from the endless handshaking. Grover Cleveland, a man who fiercely guarded his privacy, was both proud and deeply protective of his young wife. He detested the commercialization of her image and the intrusive press coverage. He once angrily remarked to an aide, "I don't see why the papers have to be so persistent in their personal attacks on Mrs. Cleveland. I'm a public character, but she is not." But he couldn't stop it. She wasn't just his wife. She belonged to the nation now. In 1888, Cleveland lost his bid for re-election to Benjamin Harrison. As they prepared to leave the White House, Frances said something remarkable to one of the staff members. With a quiet confidence, she told him to take good care of the furniture and the decorations, because they would be back in 4 years. It was a stunningly prescient comment, and she was right. The 4 years between their White House terms were a period of private happiness. They moved to New York City, and in 1891, their first child was born, a daughter named Ruth. The public was enchanted. Cleveland, who could seem so gruff and formal in public, was a doting father, and Frances embraced motherhood with all her heart. This, for a time, was a quiet, normal life, away from the glare of Washington. But as she had predicted, they returned. In 1892, Grover Cleveland accomplished a political feat that has never been repeated. He was elected president again after being voted out of office. In 1893, Frances Cleveland walked back into the White House, no longer a newlywed bride, but a seasoned political wife and a mother. Their second daughter, Esther, was born in the White House that same year, the only child of a president ever to be born there. This second term, however, was far darker than the first. The country was plunged into a severe economic depression, known as the Panic of 1893. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and the nation was gripped by unrest. The fairy tale atmosphere of their first term was gone, replaced by anxiety and hardship. And for the Clevelands, a private tragedy was looming that would eclipse any political crisis. Their daughter Ruth was a bright, beloved little girl, adored by her parents and the public alike. She was known as Baby Ruth, and stories about her filled the papers. She was the light of their lives. In the winter of 1904, after the Clevelands had retired from the White House to a peaceful life in Preston, New Jersey, the unimaginable happened. 6-year-old Ruth, who had seemed perfectly healthy, contracted diphtheria. The disease was swift and merciless. For days, Frances and Grover sat by her bedside, helpless, as the illness tightened its grip. On January 7, 1904, little Ruth died. The loss was absolute. It shattered them both. Grover Cleveland, a man of immense public fortitude, was broken. He later wrote to a friend, "I had a season of great trouble in keeping out of my mind the idea that I had been unjustly treated. But for Frances, the pain was of a different kind. A mother's grief is a silent, hollow place. She had lost her firstborn, the child who had made her a mother." One of the most enduring, though incorrect, myths in American culture is that the Baby Ruth candy bar was named after her. The Curtis Candy Company always claimed it was named for Ruth Cleveland, likely to avoid paying royalties to the famous baseball player Babe Ruth, who was rising to fame at the same time the candy was introduced in 1921. But for Frances, the name was not a sweet confection. It was a ghost, a constant public reminder of her most private and profound pain. She retreated into her grief, focusing on her surviving daughters, Esther and Marion, and later, her 2 sons. She rarely spoke of Ruth publicly, but the loss carved a permanent sadness into her heart. It was a sorrow she shared with her husband, a bond of grief that held them together through their remaining years. Grover Cleveland's health began to fail. The once robust, powerful man grew frail. In the summer of 1908, he passed away. His last words spoken to his wife were, "I have tried so hard to do right." Frances was now a widow at the age of 44, left with 4 children to raise alone. She was now a relic of a past era, the widow of a revered 2-term president. In that time, a president's widow was expected to assume a role of permanent, dignified mourning. She was a symbol of the nation's memory, her life effectively over. She was expected to wear black, live quietly, and dedicate herself to preserving her husband's legacy. And for 5 years, Frances did just that. She oversaw the publication of his letters and managed his estate with quiet competence. But Frances Cleveland was not a woman to live in the past. She was still young, full of life, and she believed she had a right to her own happiness. And so she did something that no presidential widow had ever done before. 5 years after Cleveland's death in 1913, Frances made a startling announcement. She was getting married again. Her chosen husband was Thomas J. Preston, Jr., a professor of archaeology at her alma mater, Wells College, and later at Princeton. He was an academic, a man of intellect and quiet temperament, a world away from the political battles of Washington. The great controversy of her life, of course, will always be the beginning of her story. The relationship with Grover Cleveland, the 27-year age gap, the fact that he was her legal guardian. In our modern world, we look at that with deep discomfort, and it's right that we do. The power imbalance is undeniable. We can ask the question, was it a form of grooming? Was this young woman pressured into a life she didn't choose? It's a valid and important question. But history is rarely so simple. There is no evidence that Frances was ever unhappy in her marriage. By all accounts, their relationship was one of deep mutual affection, respect, and partnership. He adored her, and she in turn was fiercely loyal and devoted to him. She was also no wilting flower. She was intelligent, educated, and possessed a will of her own. She navigated the treacherous waters of the White House with a skill that politicians twice her age envied. The decision was controversial. To some, it felt like a betrayal of President Cleveland's memory. How could the nation's first lady, a woman so tied to a president's legacy, simply move on? But to others, it was an act of profound courage. She was refusing to be a living monument. She was choosing to be a living woman. Her second marriage was, by all accounts, a happy and stable one. She was now Frances Folsom Cleveland Preston. She deliberately stepped away from the public eye, finding a peaceful private life that had so often eluded her. Yet she never forsook her past. When it came to her public duties as the former First Lady, she was always Mrs. Cleveland. In her private life, she was Mrs. Preston. It was a delicate balance, a way of honoring her past, while fully inhabiting her present. One of the most revealing and little-known stories about her later years speaks volumes about her character. During the Great Depression, she was living a comfortable but not extravagant life in Princeton. The local branch of the Needlework Guild, an organization that provided clothing to the poor, was struggling. Quietly, without any fanfare, Frances took on the job of mending secondhand clothes herself. Neighbors would see her, the former First Lady of the United States, sitting on her porch, painstakingly sewing patches onto children's sweaters and darning worn-out socks. There were no cameras, no press releases. It was an act of quiet, anonymous compassion. It was who she was. She was not an icon. She was a person who saw a need and filled it. Perhaps the truth is not one thing or the other. Perhaps it was a relationship born of a different time, with different rules, one that we can never fully understand through our own modern lens. It can be two things at once: a love story that, for them, was genuine, and a dynamic that, for us, is deeply problematic. The complexity is part of the story. To ignore it is to flatten a life into a simple caricature. So why does the story of Frances Cleveland Preston still matter today? She matters because she was a pioneer. Before she arrived, the role of the First Lady was often a stiff ceremonial duty confined to the drawing rooms of the White House. Frances transformed it into a position of profound influence and personal connection. She set a new template for the modern First Lady, a public personality, a woman who could connect with the American people on a human level. Every First Lady since who has graced the cover of a magazine, who has been celebrated for her style and charisma, walks on a path that Frances first paved. But her deeper, more lasting significance lies not in what she did, but in who she was through it all. Her life is a profound lesson in the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Think of the journey: a childhood shattered by tragedy, a youth spent under the guardianship of a future president, and then a sudden ascent into a level of fame that would crush most people, all beginning at an age when most of us are still figuring out who we are. She weathered the brutal storms of political life, endured the unspeakable grief of losing a child, and faced the profound loneliness of widowhood. And through it all, she held on to her grace, her quiet compassion, and an unshakable sense of self. Her greatest act was not one of policy or public appearance. It was the quiet, revolutionary choice to simply live. Her decision to remarry was a powerful declaration that her story was not over just because her husband's was. She refused to let her identity be entombed by the past, forever defined as the beautiful young bride of a famous man. She had been a ward, a bride, a first lady, a mother, and a widow. In the end, she chose to honor all those parts of her life, while insisting on the right to simply be a woman, living out her days in peace and on her own terms. History remembered Frances Folsom Cleveland as the radiant First Lady who captivated a nation in her youth. It was a lovely, simple story. But the real story, the one she lived for 83 years, was so much richer, deeper, and more meaningful. It is a story about the vast distance between a public image and a private soul. It is a story about finding the strength not just to mend secondhand clothes for strangers, but to painstakingly stitch back together the pieces of your own broken heart. She was the nation's fairy tale princess, yes, but her lasting legacy is a testament to something far more real and far more powerful: the quiet, enduring courage to write your own final chapter long after everyone else thinks the book is closed. She belonged to history, but in the end, the life she claimed was powerfully, triumphantly her own. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.